Welcome to the Model UN Seminar 2. These are the flipped activities for week 8. So far we have discussed the 1960s and 1970s international aid. So we saw that in the 1960s, aid was mainly financial capital, meaning money, for large-scale industrial projects. In the 1970s, the money, the international aid, was meant to reduce poverty. Even though international aid is meant to help, we can say that it was mainly a failure in the 1960s and the 1970s. It didn't help African countries and sometimes actually made the situation worse. I wish we had realized that earlier so that we had stopped with the way we're doing international aid, but as you will see in the next slide, that was not the case. In 2013, I received this piece of news from the UN Wire, and as you can see, development aid is still going strong. Today, I'd like to focus on international aid in the 1980s and the 1990s. And during these 20 years, you'll see that developed countries, right, so the donor countries, the countries that gave money, we changed our approach, right? So we give aid if blah blah blah, or in exchange of blah blah blah. So this in exchange of is called a conditionality. So it's a condition, right? We give if you do something the way we want you to do it. The first conditionality in the 1980s was to reduce the country's imbalances to reasonable levels. I am using the official wording. So what does this mean? To explain the concept of imbalance, I'd like to use the debt situation. And in this case, I'm focusing on the concessional external debt stocks, and the value is the value of the US dollars in 2013 to make it a bit easier to understand. And also, I need to say that concessional means that you are receiving aid from official lenders at concessional terms. And the terms, right, the conditions here are quite, should be favorable, should be positive, because actually 25% of the money you're receiving is in the form of a grant, and a grant you don't have to pay the money back. So you only have to pay 75% of that money back, because that is a loan. So if we look at the situation of most African countries in the 1970s, most of them started with zero debt. But let's look at their situation in 1980. I chose 4 of them, Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, Congo, and Zambia. And as you can see, by 1980, some of them had debt between $500 million, right? So the Côte d'Ivoire and Congo here, so about $500 million. And if we look at Cameroon and Zambia, it was close to $1 billion US dollar, again in 2013 US dollar value. So the jump in terms of debt is crazy. This is not balanced, right? This is way too much for, let's remember, poor countries, right? Developing countries. So this is the imbalance. Too much of something, and in this case, too much debt. And let me point out right away, because this is going to be important later on too, that the situation was not only in Africa, but also in South America. And in this case, Mexico specifically, because they started a little something that I'll explain soon. So, yes, clearly I kept Zambia, but if you still look at the situation of Mexico, it was similar to that of Zambia. Thankfully, they kind of stabilized, but then peaked again. But yes, it was not just in Africa. South America and I was also hit by the debt situation. And the reason I mentioned Mexico is because Mexico started something, and the something is not paying back the loans that they owned. So the debt imbalance became so bad, so difficult for the country to manage, that on August 12th, 1982, Mexico's Secretary of Finance, right, so the Ministry of Finance, the person in charge of the money, phoned the lenders and told them that Mexico would not be able to pay its debt, and the due date was August 16th. And following that example, other countries did the same, and in 1982, 11 countries in Africa also said they couldn't pay. So the developed countries realized that debt could fire back, meaning that they could lose the money they were lending to these countries. So the debt imbalance became a serious issue. So they decided, okay, we are not going to give you aid anymore, so basically money, if you don't improve the situation. So the first conditionality in the 1980s was to reduce the country's imbalances to reasonable levels. Again, I just focused on the debt situation, right, for the imbalance. The second conditionality was to implement a free market. What does a free market mean? Well, it means that there are few regulations, right? So it's more, you can do just about everything you want. And it also implies privatization. So meaning the company owned by a government is sold so that it becomes a private company. So few regulations and privatization basically equals to a limited government involvement in business, right? So the government is not responsible, is not in charge of what's happening in business anymore. A free market is, yes, a way to be free to succeed, but also free to fail, right? The chances are 50-50. If there is no guarantee, no protection, well, you can either succeed or fail. And Zambia, since we've been using this country as an example in the graph as well, Zambia experienced a failure, and it was with its airlines. So Zambia Airways closed because of the privatization. The privatization process in sub-Saharan Africa was actually reviewed by an expert in 2003, and the results he came up with were not as wonderful as what was expected when the conditionalities were decided. So, for instance, companies made more money right after the privatization, and that's usually why people want private companies rather than public companies. People say they are more competitive. So companies made more money right after the privatization, but the increase, right, the more money didn't last long, right? So it doesn't seem to be sustainable in the long term, right? So you make more money right after, but then it doesn't keep on going up. In addition, employment decreased, right? So less people were getting jobs. Thankfully, it looks like massive layoffs, so massive firing of people were avoided. So that's good. But still, you would hope that more people get jobs if the company is making more money, but that was not the case. And also, what was completely overlooked, so people did not think about the social aspects of privatizations. And this might be probably the heaviest issue related to privatization. Explain why I think that the social aspects of privatizations are the major drawbacks. I'll use the example of Guinea and what happened with water there. So when water was privatized, well, the price of water increased by 700% between 1989 and 1997. So in 8 years, the price of water was multiplied by 7. So imagine that you are already struggling, that you don't have enough money on an everyday basis for everything, and then all of a sudden water goes up by 7 times. That to me is terrible, because as we've studied before, water is necessary to live. This is not something you can do without. So that's why the social aspects being overlooked sound pretty terrible to me. And on top of it, the water network, so the fact that more houses, more villages would get water, well, the water network didn't expand, so did not become bigger as much as was planned. Last but not least, privatization created new opportunities for corruption. And as we saw before, corruption is a factor in preventing the development, the economic development of a country. So that is quite regrettable that privatization created more corruption. I'll give you the example of the Uganda Commercial Bank in 1997. The corruption issue is related to the Uganda Commercial Bank. The Uganda Commercial Bank is a state bank, so a bank owned by the government. To partially privatize, so not completely privatize, this public bank, right? A bank owned by the government is a public bank. Well, 49% were sold to Westmoreland of Malaysia. The money Westmoreland of Malaysia paid for the 49% of Uganda Commercial Bank, that money went to the government, right? Since it's a state bank, the government got the money. To pay for the 49%, Westmoreland of Malaysia took out a loan at the Greenland Bank. Well, Greenland Bank is a private commercial bank, and it belongs to the Greenland Investment Group. When this was happening, Uganda president was Museveni. And surprise, surprise, if you look at who was one of the main shareholders, so another way of saying this is one of the main owners of Greenland Investment Group, well, it was Salim Saleh, the brother of Uganda's president. This could be considered a form of corruption, because a state bank was bought by a company who received the money for the loan to pay for the bank from a company that is connected to the president of the country. Corruption became very clear when, under Westmoreland of Malaysia leadership, the Uganda Commercial Bank granted, which means gave, unsecured loans, loans that had no guarantee that they would be paid back. And those loans were not small, they represented 40 million US dollars. And these loans were given to companies associated with Greenland Investment Group. And remember, Greenland Investment Group main owner was the president's brother. So he got money with no conditions to pay it back. Thankfully, the corruption was discovered and the central bank took over the management of Uganda Commercial Bank, and actually Greenland Bank too, until the deal with Westmoreland of Malaysia was called off, so it was cancelled. And actually later on, the Uganda Commercial Bank was again bidded, so offered to be bought, to be privatized, and it was bought by a bank in South Africa. So yes, corruption is something that we want to avoid, but if the conditionalities imposed by international aid create more opportunities, I definitely think those conditionalities are not right. We can add what happened with international aid in the 1980s, and the key word for the 1980s is conditionalities. The first one was reducing imbalances, because the level of debt, for instance, in some countries was really too high. And the second conditionality was to implement free market, and we saw that it wasn't without drawbacks, without negative points. So let's move on to the 1990s conditionalities, and the first one was good governance. So good governance means strong and trustworthy institutions, right? So trustworthy means an institution that you can trust, right? If there is a problem, you can go to the institution and you know it will take care of it. In addition, good governance means transparent laws, so laws that are not meant to trick people, laws that are clear and easy to follow and respect. And obviously, good governance means no corruption as well. If we look at corruption, and I'm using here the data from a website called Transparency International. If you are interested in corruption, I would highly recommend to go and check it out. It's very well done. So every year, Transparency International releases a corruption perception map, and the map here is for 2014. So yes, deep red means very corrupt, and yellow means very clean. I was pretty disappointed to see that my own country was just orange, not quite yellow. Anyhow, let's look more closely at the situation in African countries. Yes, African countries are sadly very red, and which shows that corruption is still a huge issue on the continent. So if we look at the first conditionality of the 1990s, we realize that, at least as far as corruption is concerned, it is still not a reality in 2014. The second conditionality was democracy. And you have a democracy when elections are open, free, and fair, and all adults can vote, right? So free means actually you don't have to pay to go and vote, and fair, think that it means you can have as many candidates as possible, and they all have a chance to be voted for, right? So no restrictions in terms of candidate. In addition, a democracy means that you have civil and political freedom, right? So you are free to express your political ideas, and in terms of society, you also have rights guaranteed, such as, let's say, the right to religion, the right to education, right? Last but not least, a democracy means that the government, the people who control the government, are not from the army, so no military control of government, and they're not from a religion, so there is no religious control of government. Well, even nowadays, democracy is not a reality for many Africans. One reason is that establishing a multi-party democracy, so meaning a democracy that has more than one political party does not mean that the democratic country will have high quality institutions. And the institutions are what make a democracy, right? So these institutions are connected to laws, right? So effective laws, laws that respect human rights and protect people, respecting property right, and this is important for businesses. When they create something, you want to be able to own that right and be able to make money out of those rights. Independent justice, meaning the justice is fair, it does not ask or is not controlled by groups, it's just itself and makes decisions based on the laws. So having a multi-party democracy doesn't mean that you will have the institutions that actually make a democracy. In other words, you can use the name democracy without having the organizations that make the country a true democracy. So how can you have the name but not the reality of a democracy? Well, especially in African countries, people have noticed that it's not because you have the name that rival parties, so parties who have different ideas, will stop fighting. And in addition, even if they're not physically fighting, so probably leading to some sort of civil wars, you still have different interests. And those interests don't just disappear because there's a democracy, right? And actually, Moyo in Dead Aid says that African countries need a decisive, benevolent dictator to push through the reforms required to get the economy moving. And this really struck me. I know it might be a bit shocking because she uses the word dictator, but let's focus on also the adjectives she's using to describe him, right? So decisive, he has a specific goal. He knows where he wants to go. And the goal is not his own personal goal, it's a benevolent one. So he means well. He wants or she wants the country to get better. And after the initial shock, I actually thought about someone I respect very much, and his name is Nelson Mandela. And I think that in a way, he could be seen this way too, a decisive, benevolent dictator. So let me share with you a scene from Invictus called that I call the Springboks rugby team speech. So please go on the website and watch the scene from the movie. As you probably understood from the scene, actually Nelson Mandela asked the sports committee to change its mind, to change a vote that they had taken earlier regarding the fate, the future of the Springboks rugby team in South Africa. And he did it because he knew better. He knew that by taking away the Springboks rugby team, the white South Africans, so the Afrikaners, would be extremely angry, and it would become really even harder to work with them in trying to make the country better. So Nelson Mandela's goal was a good goal, but in a way he asked a committee to change its vote, right? And he influenced that vote. And technically, in terms of democracy, this is not quite democratic. But again, sometimes you need a benevolent dictator to make things move in the right direction. So yes, I agree with Moyo, but keep in mind, I want someone who means well, right? So someone who wants the country to get better, and especially someone who knows better, right? So someone who has thought and researched and discussed his opinion, not just a person who just wants power and wants to control everything. So sadly, many African countries don't seem to have found this someone, right? This benevolent dictator. The key word to summarize 1990s international aid is the same as in the 1980s, and it's conditionalities, right? So developed countries had two conditions to keep on giving international aid, and it was good governance, and we saw that sadly even nowadays, at least as far as corruption is concerned, the situation isn't quite what it should be, and it's a similar state with democracy, right? It's still not where it should be.